Welcome back to Liam's AP Psychology. My name is Liam Jinso Kim, a rising junior in Korea International School Jeju campus, and today we're going to learn about Unit 4, which is about learning, in the AP Psychology course. To start with, we're going to talk about Module 29 today, which is about biology, cognition, and learning. Now, we're going to talk about some biological constraints and conditioning. In biological constraints and conditioning, there are limits to classical conditioning. So people thought you could classically condition any stimulus with any response, but that turned out not to be true. The truth found by John Garcia was that John Garcia tried associating the sickness caused by radioactive water, which is the unconditioned stimulus, with different types of neutral stimuli like taste, sight, or sound. And he found that the sickness could be associated with taste, but not with other types of stimuli. So why was this the case? This was because of a phenomenon called biological disposition. Rats have adapted and evolved to sense things that make them sick with taste, not sight or sound. This made associating sickness with taste possible, but not with others. This association with taste and other undesirable stimulus is called taste aversion. You become averse, which means you do not like the taste, therefore you do not want to go through it anymore. So some similar results with humans are, if you get sick from seafood, then you might become very averse to the taste of seafood, but not so much to the sight or sound of seafood, because it was the taste of seafood that made you sick. Strangely enough, however, birds associated sight rather than taste because they usually use sight to distinguish dangerous foods. Now let's look at some limits on operant conditioning. Similar to the case of classical conditioning, some responses are more easily shaped and maintained than others based on our biological disposition. You can teach pigeons to flap wings to avoid a shock because pigeons usually flap wings to avoid danger. But you can't really teach pigeons to peck to avoid a shock because pecking usually has to do with eating, not avoiding danger. Even if you did somehow teach pigeons to peck to avoid a shock, that behavior would be extinct quickly. Behaviors that go against or are very different from the biological disposition is unlearned quickly. Now let's look at some cognition and conditioning. In the area of classical conditioning, the more predictable an unconditioned stimulus is, based on a conditioned stimulus, the stronger the conditioned response becomes. Basically, animals learn to expect an unconditioned stimulus based on a conditioned stimulus and produce the conditioned response. And association can influence attitude. If you constantly associate something with something positive, you will have a more positive attitude about it. For example, if you are shown the same picture of a person to people, but associate it with something positive, such as some positive words for description like amazing or honest, you will like that person more. An attitude can also influence association. If you know the difference between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, classical conditioning is less likely to occur. For example, an alcohol addiction patient were given alcohol drinks with nauseating drugs in them. The idea was to associate alcohol with nausea to lessen their desire to drink by taste aversion. However, since the patients knew that nausea came from some other drug rather than the alcohol itself, taste aversion in this case did not occur that much. Now let's look at operant conditioning. In contrast with Skinner's firm belief in the idea that cognition had nothing to do with behavior, cognitive processes are involved in operant conditioning as well. So a cognitive map is a mental map of a spatial area, like a mental map of a maze or your house. Now let's look at latent learning. Latent learning is learning that occurs but is only visible when there is a reinforcing stimulus. Rats were allowed to roam around the maze. Without a reinforcing stimulus, it didn't seem like they learned much. However, later, when they were given a reinforcing stimulus like cheese for successfully getting out of the maze, they were much better than the other rats who didn't spend time in the maze before. Basically, their learning was shown only when they had a reinforcing stimulus, even though the learning itself was already occurring. An insight is a sudden realization of a problem's solution. Now let's look at intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is a desire to perform a behavior effectively for its own sake. Basically, you're doing it because you want to or like doing it. For example, although this might not be true for most of you, some people may study mathematics because they really love math. For most of you, you may like playing League of Legends or watching YouTube or playing MLB The Show because you really like playing video games. You really like watching funny short videos on YouTube, right? And that's intrinsic motivation. You're doing an action because you really want to do it and you enjoy it. Now let's look at extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is a desire to perform a behavior effectively for rewards or to avoid punishment. Basically, you're doing it because you want to get something out of it. For example, one may study mathematics because they want to get a good grade so that they can get into a good college, so that they can get a good job, so that they can make a lot of money, right? I think that's the case for most of the students here. You may watch my AP Psychology course videos because you want to get a good score on the AP Psychology exam in May. And, well, although there might be some students who study because of intrinsic motivation, well, those students are really esteemed students, right? Most of us, I believe, study because of an extrinsic motivation because ultimately we want to get good grades, and because we believe that good grades lead to a successful life with a good quality. Well, I can't say good grades lead to a good quality of life always, but it is the general belief, right? General belief. So maybe that's why you're watching my AP Psychology video at the moment. And yeah, that's what extrinsic motivation is. You're doing it because you are anticipating a return for it. Now, this is the end of today's lecture, and in our next video, we're gonna continue on with talking about learning and personal control. Goodbye, folks.